Hello, and welcome to a Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness video, where today I'm going to be using Gen 1's most recognizable birds, those being Pidgeot and Fearow. Now, despite their obvious similarities being normal flying types, there is actually quite a bit of difference in their move pools and stats that I think sets them apart enough to where I think that one actually has a slight advantage over the other one. And so, as always, I will start with the one that I predict will do the best, and that today is Pidgeot, who has 83 HP, 80 attack, 75 defense, 70 special attack, 70 special defense, and 91 speed. And through level up it gets access to only normal and flying attacking types, and that stands true for both of its TMs and Tutor, other than Thief. And so while it does suffer from an extremely shallow move pool, it does start out pretty strong with Gust and Quick Attack being strong stab options for it. And while that is a great start for it, it's not the reason I think that Pidgeot is going to win this race. I think it's mostly the move Feather Dance, a move that lowers the opponent's attack by 2 stages. Now, the problem right now is that Pidgeot has a very shallow move pool, and unfortunately that means that it can't hit rock or steel types for neutral damage. The lucky thing about that, though, is most of the rock and steel types are physical attackers. So, as long as I'm able to lower their attack far enough that they're not an issue anymore, I can basically ignore them. And it gives me an option to slowly whittle them down when I get to them. Of course, this whole plan hinges on the fact that they never get a critical hit, but it at least gives Pidgeot an option for dealing with them that Fearow does not have. Now, of course, this is the main plan, but it can also reliably be a fallback in case I get a good hidden power type that can deal with either rock or steel. And of course, there's always the chance to go out of my way to go get Facade. So now moving on to our Pidgeot in particular, it has a serious nature. Originally it had a quiet nature, but because that is a very negative nature for it, I went ahead and set it to a neutral one. So now it is very serious in the fight. It gets access to the Keen Eye ability, which prevents its accuracy from being lowered, which does come up occasionally in this game, and it starts with Tackle, Sand Attack, Gust, and Quick Attack. So with that, let's go ahead and get right into it. Now, of course, like I was saying before, Pidgeot really has no issue in the early game, able to take down every opponent in 1 or 2 hits because of its great moves and also good stats. So really, nothing here is all that threatening. So after quickly taking down the old man, we now move on to the Cypher base, where today I decided to fight Green because I have super effective damage against all of his grass types. Anyway, with that, let's go ahead and just do a little bit of rambling. If you are enjoying this video so far, consider liking, and if you have any Pokemon suggestions, please put them down below. Now, recently, I remember saying Skitty had the most active idle animation, but I think I actually have to give it to Pidgeot. It is flailing everywhere. And here it is at 1x speed, and yeah, it's just constantly moving all the time, which I guess makes sense considering it's flying in the air, but still, it's got a lot of movement to it. And Pidgeot is a very interesting Pokemon to be because as a kid playing Stadium, I always thought that it was worse than Pidgeotto because its name was shorter, even though on the rental screen it always shows them in the evolutionary order. But anyway, we defeat Green, and now moving on, at level 20, Pidgeot gets Whirlwind, which I decided to go ahead and teach over Tackle. And then at level 27, Pidgeot gets the move Wing Attack, which I teach over Gust. And then I move on to the move Tutor, where I get the move Mimic for the upcoming fight against Naps. Now, usually I don't bring up the Naps fight too often, but because of his Rhyhorn, he could be a real issue. So I decide to use Sand Attack right away to lower its accuracy. And while it's not really doing that much damage, I also can't deal much damage to it. So I decide to go ahead and mimic the move Pursuit. That way I can deal some special attacking damage. That should hopefully allow me to take it down much quicker. I take down the Murkrow with Wing Attack, and then out comes Slackoth. And I think that Slackoth should go down to a single Wing Attack. Okay, it was very close, but not quite. Rhyhorn finally misses an attack. I go for Pursuit into Rhyhorn, dealing half. Slackoth is, of course, loafing around, and I decide to just go ahead and take down the Rhyhorn at this point, since the Slackoth is only going to be attacking every other turn. And then he sends out his final Pokemon, the Beldum, which I go for Pursuit into, and it's not quite half, so Beldum will be a 3-shot. It does do quite a bit of damage though. Go for another Pursuit, taking it down to low red. Scratch takes me down to 11, Takedown takes me down to 3, and since Slackoth is going to be loafing around this turn, I'm able to beat Naps on the first attempt, though it was very close. Now moving on to low red, she leads with a Love Disc and a Beautifly, and right away I go for Wing Attack to take down the Beautifly. Then she sends out Roselia, which should also go down to a single Wing Attack, which it does, and then she sends out her final Pokemon, a Shadow Delcatty. And at this point, I don't think I can really lose unless I get some terrible luck. Go for Wing Attack, hitting Delcatty, taking it down to half, And Shadow Rush does almost nothing, go for another wing attack to finish it off, and then all that's left is the Love Disc. Really, the only way I could have lost that is if Delcatty's cute charm ability came into play, but luckily it didn't, and so I was able to take Lavrina down on the first attempt. Now, of course, you can't have a Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness video, especially a versus one, without the obligatory Mirror B. And with Mirror B reached, I think it's about time we move over back to Fearow, who has 65 HP, 90 attack, 65 defense, 61 special attack, 61 special defense, and 100 speed. So it's a bit faster and stronger than Pidgeot, but its defenses are a little bit worse. It gets access to mostly normal and flying type moves, however it also gets the move Pursuit, which is interesting because that will allow it to hit rock types. Not steel types, but it is at least something it has. And on top of that, it also gets Drill Peck, the best flying type move in the game. So it has a lot of great things about it that honestly made choosing between it and Pidgeot very difficult. I think the only other thing to nitpick is that both Peck and Fury Attack are just worse than Quick Attack and Gust in most instances. And it doesn't get a better move until level 40, but that's really not too big of an issue, at least in the early game. So with that, there is one other thing I want to mention, and that is Hidden Power. Now, if this Fearow does not get a good Hidden Power type, there is a Spearow right before the Snaddle fight that I might end up going for. So with that, let's go ahead and move on to our Fearow, which has a naughty nature, raising its attack but lowering its special defense, which I'd say is a pretty good nature for it. It gets access to the Keen Eye ability, preventing accuracy loss, and it gets access to Peck, Growl, Leer, and Fury Attack by level 10. So with that, let's go ahead and get right into it. Just like with Pidgeot, the early game really isn't all that bad. I'm able to take down Abra in a single hit, and then I can take down the Shroomish in a single hit, and then all that's left is the Horsey, which of course goes down in 2 hits. Now moving on to the battle against the Power Rangers, and I also decide to fight Green with Fearow, and I just have to say that Fearow has some of the kookiest animations I think I've ever seen. Like, he pulls himself back, spreads his wings, and pecks forward. Like, he could have just done that from the position he was in, and it probably would have looked a little better, but anyway, even though I do have a few gripes with some of his animations, I do think that he also has one of the best animations in the game that still continues the same vibe that he has in all of his others that we'll get to very soon. Anyway, with that, we're just about finished with the Cypher battle, so let's move into the Cypher base, where I run into a Sharpedo, which I'm going to catch for the Black Glasses item. Unless I take it down in a single hit. Well, that's a bit unfortunate, but anyway, at level 26 I get the move Pursuit, which I teach over Growl, and then I go into the battle against Naps. Now, unlike Pidgeot, I don't need to waste a turn picking up Pursuit because I can just use it right away, and it's doing about a third. Now, this is the other move I was talking about, where it just flings its wings around. I guess it's not a special attacker, so it kind of makes sense. Either that or it's because it acts as a projectile, so it's like flapping its wings to create gusts of whatever it is. But we take down Rhyhorn, then he sends out Slackoth, and I get taken down to 24 by another Pursuit, go for Fury Attack, hoping that it hit 3 times, but it only hit twice, so it survives, and I get taken down to 5. I do take down the Murkrow, but unfortunately, after Beldum comes out, I have no way of taking it down in a single hit. And unfortunately, it looks like Slackoth's going to be a 4-shot, so I decide to go ahead and do a little bit of extra training, get up to level 29, and now with that little bit of health and damage, I'm able to take down Naps on the second attempt. So now moving on to Lavrina, she leads with a Love Disc and a Beautifly, and I go for Peck, taking down the Beautifly, and then out comes the Roselia. Love Disc hits a Water Gun, dealing almost no damage, go for Peck, taking Roselia down in a single hit, and then she sends out Delcatty, once again, her Shadow Pokemon, and it should go down in 2 shots. Unless it's not quite a 2-shot. Okay, well, Shadow Wave comes out, dealing a decent amount. I decide to go for Fury Attack, and I get a crit to finish it off, leaving just the Love Disc behind. I go for Peck, taking it down to low red, and one more Peck finishes it off. So with that, an easy first try Lavrina, and let's go ahead and move on to the obligatory Mirror B once again. And this is our first stop to see how well these two are doing, and how well they were able to make it through the early game. So, moving over to the chart, and at 1x speed, currently Pidgeot is in the lead at 2 hours and 10 minutes, and Fearow at 2 hours and 20 minutes, so there's about a 10-minute difference between these two. However, Fearow did suffer a loss to Naps, so it definitely could have been a bit closer had I just put a little bit more time into leveling beforehand. It's also missing a strong damaging move right now, so hopefully that doesn't end up hurting it too much in the next stretch of the game. With that being said, let's go ahead and move back over to Pidgeot, where at level 34 it finally gets the move Feather Dance, which I decide to teach over Sand Attack. And then I fumble my way into the Real Game Tower to go pick up a Hidden Power, and then I'm also going to pick up Protect, unless I'm one off and I accidentally pick up Light Screen. Oops. Oh well, it's fine. And then I'm going to go ahead and teach Hidden Power right away to Pidgeot, which happens to be Hidden Power Rock at 47 base power, which might end up skewing things even more for Pidgeot, if not for the fact I still can't hit Steel types. Anyway, moving on to Snaddle, and he leads with a Quagsire and a Lantern, and I go for Wing Attack into Quagsire right away, dealing half of its health, and I'm able to take it down on the following turn, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, a Shadow Lunatone, and this is unfortunately where things start going downhill very quickly. Hidden Power is neutral, but it's only doing about a third, so in the time that it takes me to take it down, it'll be able to set up Shadow Sky and also use Shadow Wave, so there's no way for me to really get past it, and Wing Attack is doing even less. So after a few more attempts, I decide to go ahead and go over to Mount Battle to do some extra training. I do a few more attempts in between, but I eventually come back and do the long grind all the way to the move Facade, a 70 base power move that doubles in power when you have a status effect. So I go over to a Gate Village to go get poisoned by this guy's 2 Dustox, and then I go into the battle against Snaddle once again. I go with Facade to take down Lantern on the first turn, because I know Quagsire is going to have to use at least 3 Rock Tombs to slow me down enough for him to be an issue. And I go for another Facade into Lunatone, now with the much higher level advantage and also doubled power plus stab. I'm able to take it down in a single hit, another Facade to take down Castform, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, a Matang, which, because of Facade's huge power, is going to take it down, and all that's left is the Quagsire, which goes down to a single Facade as well. Oh, and I decide not to learn Agility. But anyway, now with Snaddle defeated, we move right along to Gonzap, who leads with an Electrode and a Nuzleaf, and right away the Nuzleaf is going to go for Fake Out, so there's really nothing I can do here. Electrode hits a Spark, though luckily it didn't paralyze. Go for Facade, which does take it down, and luckily Static didn't happen either. Hyper Beam doesn't really do that much damage. I go for another Wing Attack to take down the Vileplume, and then he sends out Whiscash, which unfortunately I don't think I can take down in a single hit. I go for Facade, dealing way more than I expected, taking it down to low red. Hyper Beam also doesn't do much from Whiscash either. I finish it off, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, which is Skarmory. And while I don't have any way to finish it off in a single hit, it's really not all that much of a threat, though just to be safe I do go for Feather Dance, and it hits a critical hit Hyper Beam just to spite me. So I go for Wing Attack to finish off the Nuzleaf, and then all that's left is Skarmory, which I decide to go for Facade into, dealing about a third. And its Hyper Beams aren't really doing much to me. Another Facade takes it down to low yellow, and one last Facade finishes it off. So with that, we beat Gonzap on the first attempt, and we move on to finding another Pidgeotto. Hello there, other Pidgeotto. Goodbye, other Pidgeotto. And now moving on to the battle against Scorpion, he lives with a Celio and a Lairon, and right away I go for Facade, taking down Celio in a single hit, and then he sends out Slowking. Now, Lairon is a Pokemon that both Pidgeot and Fearow have to worry about because it is a Rock Steel type, making it 4 times resistant against basically all of their moves. And to make matters worse, in the refight against Scorpion later on, he evolves his Lairon into an Aggron, making it even more defensive and stronger. And so it's taking down this line in particular that I think is going to make Pidgeot better with Feather Dance. Now returning to the fight, I take down the Slowking and then he sends out Ursaring. It's not quite a one-shot either, and unfortunately my health is getting so low that even though I get to see his Shadow Primeape come out, unfortunately I get taken down by Lairon on the very next turn. With a crit, but I don't think it mattered. Now moving on to the 4th attempt, and right away I use Feather Dance on Lairon, that way it's not nearly as threatening. However, by doing that, that does leave me open to both of them attacking, which they do on this attempt. However, in previous attempts I had Celio get an attack drop with Aurora Beam right off the bat, which immediately puts me on the back foot and of course resulted in a loss. And of course Lairon always has the chance to lower my defense whenever Iron Tail hits. So this battle does come down to a good bit of luck. Also, since I am only a level higher, I'm still not getting a KO on Slowking, and probably not on Ursaring either, giving Lairon more opportunities to hit the Iron Tails, lowering my defense further. Which of course it does, and it gets a crit taking me down to half, and it lowers my defense at the same time. So right now I'm neutral to Lairon once again, and even though I'd really like to set up another Feather Dance, I really need to take down the bigger threats. Luckily Ursaring did go down, so it must have been a range that I didn't quite hit before. Then he sends out his Shadow Primeape, and I should be able to take that down with a single Wing Attack, and then he'll send out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Hypno. Now Hypno is probably going to take a couple hits to take down, and Lairon is not letting up on the Iron Tails. Now, one thing that I do have going in my favor is that eventually Lairon will run out of Iron Tail PP and be forced to use Takedown. Now, to my surprise, Hypno actually goes down in a single hit, and then all that's left is Lairon, and I've gone ahead and sped up this part of the video because this half of the battle is nearly as long as the first half of the battle just fighting Lairon, so it does take quite a while. I of course set up 2 feathered dances in order to lower its attack as much as possible, and now it's thankfully run out of Iron Tail PP, so it is using Takedown, slowly whittling itself down at the same time, and it's not dealing enough damage to actually hurt me. However, if it got a crit at any point in this battle, I'm almost certain Pidgeot would have gone down. So with that, we are able to make it to the final area of the game, and Pidgeot got here fairly quickly. So let's go ahead and move on to our other competitor once again, Fearow, who is now learning the move Mirror Move at 32. And while I really don't plan on using this move, I just wanted to see the animation for it. And it's alright, I guess. I do like the clear circle kind of forming between the wings, but anyway, moving on. At the Railgun Tower, I go pick up my 2 favorite TMs, Hidden Power and Protect, and this time I do a much better job going through the menu. And right away, I'm going to teach Hidden Power. And unfortunately, Fearow gets quite possibly the worst Hidden Power. Hidden Power Flying. It does do more than Peck, but it's still probably the worst thing it could have gotten. And so here we go to Fearow's second advantage, maybe, against Pidgeot. And that is the fact that you can catch a Spearow here, and it may be worth switching to. Now, of course, there are 3 main downsides to this. The first is the cost of purification and the time it takes to level it up, as well as the change in nature, because Fearow actually had a pretty good nature. However, the upsides to this are that it could have a better hidden power type, as well as it starts off with better moves. So this one in particular has a careful nature, which raises its special defense but lowers its special attack, which is honestly fine. In fact, the higher special defense might actually be helpful. And it has the move Aerial Ace, which is way better than Peck. It also gets access to Hidden Power Fighting, which is 4 times effective against those Rock Steel types. So I think given this information, I am going to stick with the Spearow. Of course, it does take a little while to level it up, but I eventually go into the battle against Snapple. He leads with a Lantern and a Quagsire, and I go for Aerial Ace, taking Quagsire down to half, and I'm doing nearly half the Lantern with Hidden Power. So while it isn't quite enough to beat him, it certainly does look promising with just a few more levels. So after losing, I decide to go ahead and do the same thing I did with Pidgeot and go and pick up the move Facade, which I decide to teach over to Leer. And on the way there, I also got the move Drill Peck, which I taught over Aerial Ace. And then I go back into the battle again, and despite having Facade now, I decide not to go into this battle poisoned because Pidgeot really struggled against the Rock and Steel types that could resist it, so it needed that extra power, whereas I think Fearow with Hidden Power is still going to be strong enough to take them both down. And Lunatone gets taken down to half, so I know for a fact he'll go down the following turn. And then he sends out his Cast Form, which is going to go down to a single Drill Peck, and I think with enough Fruity Pebble damage, Quagsire should go down the same way as well. But I am a bit worried about his final Pokemon, which is Metang, because while I do deal decent damage to it, I would think with Hidden Power, it does have the move Thunder Punch, which on top of doing super effective damage is also going to have a chance to paralyze. But of course it gets a critical hit, taking me down to 1 HP after the Fruity Pebbles, so I decide to go for Hidden Power just to see how much it'll do, and I get a crit right back, taking it down. Take that, Metang. Anyway, right before the next fight, I teach Protect, and then I go into the battle against Gonzap. He leads with Electrode and a Nuzleaf, and on the first turn, I go for Protect just so I don't get hit by Spark. And then I go for Facade to take down Electrode right away, and luckily Fearow doesn't get affected by Electrode static. Hyper moves really aren't doing that much damage. I go for Drill Peck to take down Vileplume in a single hit, and then he sends out Whiscash. And unlike Pidgeot, I think there's a solid chance I can take it down in a single hit, which I do. Then he sends out his final Pokemon, Skarmory. And while it might take a few hits to take down, Hidden Power should deal quite a bit to it, and a crit certainly helps. It would have been a 3-shot. Hidden Power finishes it off, and then all that's left is the Nuzleaf, which goes down to a single Drill Peck. So a very easy Gonzap fight, which leads us directly into Gorgon, who leads with a Lairon and a Celio, and this time I actually did come poisoned. That way I could take down all of his Pokemon in a single hit without having to worry about any ranges, because Fearow is a little bit lower level than Pidgeot was, so I'm assuming it'll be doing about the same amount of damage. So just to be safe, I go ahead and come pre-poisoned, so I'm able to take down all of his major threats in one hit. However, my health is slowly dropping, so I am going to have to rely on a Lairon miss or two, which I do get one. Primeape goes down, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, Hypno, and even though I am getting a bit low, as long as Lairon isn't able to hit, I might have been able to defeat him, but I come back again, now a level higher, and this time I'm actually going to believe in the strength of Fearow, because I think maybe I was a little too worried. None of these Pokemon are doing a ton of damage to it, and as long as I'm not taking constant Poison Chip, I think everything should go down pretty quickly. A lucky crit does take down Slowking, though I'm not sure if it actually mattered, because Ursaring also goes down to Drill Peck, and then out comes the Primeape once again, which absolutely goes down to a Drill Peck without any issue. And then he sends out his final Pokemon once again, that Shadow Hypno, which I think should also go down to a Drill Peck no problem, which will just leave the Lairon, which I have 4 times effective damage for, but actually Hypno does survive on just a little bit of HP, which makes me wonder if I got lucky with Pidgeot getting a good range or not. Anyway, I finish it off, and then Lairon really shouldn't be that much of a threat as long as it doesn't start getting defense drops. Go for Protect just in case, and then go for Hidden Power, getting a crit, taking it down right away. Okay, with that, Gorgon is defeated, and now we move on to Citridark Isle with our 2 competitors. Now, unfortunately, there was a bit of a gap created because I decided to go the Spearow route, so there is about an hour difference between these two. However, if Pidgeot were to slow down too much on the last few fights, I could definitely see it losing this. With that being said, it does have Hidden Power Rocks, so Greavil, probably the hardest fight in the game, isn't going to be so bad for it. However, there is still the rematch against Gorgon, who does have the Aggron, so maybe that will end up stalling it long enough for Fearow to catch up. I'm not exactly sure, but don't count Fearow out just yet because I think it might be able to make a bit of a comeback. So with that, let's go and move on to Pidgeot once again. Going into the battle against Lavrina, she leads with a Gorbis and a Gardevoir, and right away I take down the Gorbis because it is the opposite gender of Pidgeot, so I don't want to get attracted, and then I go for Wing Attack to take down Roselia so it doesn't set up Leech Seed. She then sends out Farfetch'd, her first Shadow Pokemon, and it likes to set up Shadow Sky or Shadow Panic, so I'd really like neither of those, so I take it down right away, and then she sends out our final Pokemon, a Shadow Altaria. At this point, I've let Gardevoir stick around too long because I'm just risking getting frozen, so I take it down this turn. Altaria goes for Shadow Break, dealing almost nothing actually. I go for Facade, taking it down to low red, and even its critical Shadow Breaks do almost nothing to me, so I finish it off with ease. So now at the top of the volcano, I run into Snaddle, he leads with a Quagsire and a Batang, and I go for Facade into Quagsire right away, not quite enough to take it down though, and it decides to go for Waterfall, not really doing that much damage either. Now, the main reason I was trying to take down Quagsire is because it likes to go for Body Slam a lot of the time when it can't hit you with a ground type move, but in this case it seems to just be going for Waterfalls, so I think I'm going to leave it be for now and instead focus on taking down Matang. Now, unfortunately Matang isn't quite a 2-shot, so it is going to take another hit to finish off. Though, luckily, I don't end up getting frozen, so it will go down this following turn. Now, unfortunately, Matang isn't even his strongest Pokemon that I have to deal with, because once it goes down, then he sends out Scizor. Now, luckily, Scizor is neutral to my Flying-type moves, but it still will take a couple hits to actually take it down because of its high defense stat. So I go for Wing Attack, and it actually does more than I expected, taking it down to red. But the Scizor also doesn't deal as much damage as I expected, so I'm able to take it down pretty easily. But then he sends out his actual strongest threat on the team, and that is Shadow Solrock. On top of being a Shadow Pokemon, setting up Shadow Sky, it is also a Rock type. And Facade isn't quite doing half, so it will be a 3-shot without a crit, and it sets up Shadow Sky, so now I lose my leftovers healing. Though it will eventually take down its own partner Quagsire, which is kind of nice. However, it does put me in a bit of an awkward position. I go for another Facade, taking it down to low red, and it hits a Shadow Rave, taking me down to half, and Waterfall does a little more. And the reason I say it's a bit of an awkward position is because out comes Castform, which isn't really going to do much damage with Thunderbolt, but it always has a chance to paralyze. And because I really want to get rid of the Solrock this turn, I'm going to take it down, and that leaves me open to that 10% chance before he sends out his final Pokemon, a Shadow Starmie, and being paralyzed would make me slower than it. Luckily, that doesn't end up happening. I go for Facade to take it down, and then all that's left is that Castform, which I'm able to take down with one last Facade. A very long fight, but I'm able to beat him on the first attempt. Now moving on to Ardos, he leads with a Shadow Swallow and Alakazam, and luckily I'm able to outspeed both of them and take down Alakazam right away. And then out comes Kingdra. Swallow decides to go for Shadow Half, and I suspect it's because I'm over 200 HP, which is generally the rule of thumb to know when it's going to do that. So I take down the Kingdra, then I go for Wing Attack to take down the Heracross, and then he sends out his next Shadow Pokemon, a Shadow Electabuzz. Swallow decides to go for Shadow Sky this turn, And then I decide to take down Electabuzz. Because the Swallow is less than half health, I'm hoping that it decides to go for Shadow Half, which it does, taking its own partner Snorlax down to half health. And from there, I think Pidgeot might actually be strong enough to take it down. Go for Facade, and it does go down, and then all that's left is Swallow, which I outspeed and finish off. So with that, we beat Ardos on the first attempt. Now onto the rematch against Scorpion, and this might be the hardest fight, or maybe second hardest fight in the entire game for Pidgeot. I'm not able to take down Slowking right away, which is very unfortunate, so it's able to get off an Ice Beam, dealing quite a bit of damage to me. So I have to finish it off on the following turn, and then he sends out Aggron. Now, like before, I need to lower Aggron's attack, that way it's not nearly as offensive. The problem is that because of its much higher defense stat, it is going to take a much longer time taking it down, giving it more opportunities to lower my defense. And once it runs out of those, instead of having takedown, it now has double edge, dealing quite a lot more damage. And on top of that, it doesn't have a miss chance anymore. It gets a crit and a defense drop in the same turn, and unfortunately, even with a Facade, I'm not able to take down Walrein in a single hit, so it hits an Ice Beam taking me down to 32, and Iron Tail finishes me off. Now, strangely enough, despite me hyping up this battle as possibly the hardest in the entire game, this is attempt number 2 where I actually win. Right away, it doesn't start out very well because Slash gets a critical hit, taking me down about a third, but a lot of just playing it very safe with Protects every other turn, and not getting crit or having my defense dropped by Aggron eventually leads to a victory. I go for Facade, of course I'm still not able to take down Walrein in a single hit, and Iron Tail gets its first defense drop, which luckily Iron Tails really aren't doing that much damage to begin with, so it's not too worrying just yet. However, as I'm saying that, it gets a second defense drop. Wing Attack takes down Poliwrath, his first Shadow Pokemon, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, a Shadow Mr. Mime. Luckily, it misses, and I'm able to take down the Mr. Mime at decent health. Now, just like the Lairon before, I need to immediately lower its attack all the way down to -6, that way it's dealing almost no damage. Of course, this whole plan falls through if it ever gets a crit, and every time it lowers my defense, it's getting closer to dealing neutral damage once again. Though, luckily, it runs out of Iron Tail PP, and now it's swapped over to Double Edge, which, while doing a lot more damage compared to Takedown, at -3, it's really not bad at all. I've also abandoned Protect altogether because it's only doing marginally more damage than I'm healing, and if I get crit at any point, it's over anyway, so there's really no reason to do it. And surprisingly, I get through this fight on the second attempt. Now moving on to Eldest, he leads with a Shadow Manectric and Ninjask, and right away the Ninjask is going for Protect, and I go for Facade to take down the Manectric. It also has Static, so I could have been paralyzed there, but it didn't end up happening. Of course, Salamence's Intimidate does lower my attack, so I might not be able to take his Pokemon down too quickly now. Shadow Rush doesn't deal that much damage after I set up a Feather Dance. However, after its Intimidate, I'm not sure how much damage I'm going to be dealing in return. I go for Facade, and it's doing about a third, though it definitely could be a range. Now luckily, I am healing more damage than it's dealing after 2 turns, so I am going to stay at full health at this point, as long as it doesn't end up getting a crit. And luckily it doesn't, so I will be able to take down the Salamence, and that brings out his next Pokemon, which is a Flygon. Now Flygon is quite a lot weaker than Salamence is, but with the Intimidate, I'm definitely going to need at least 2 shots to take it down, and that seems to be the case. I think had the Intimidate not happened, there's a good chance I could have taken down Flygon in a single hit. So I finish it off on the next turn, and then he sends out his next Pokemon, which is a Shadow Marowak. And it's actually extremely dangerous because it's holding the Thick Club item, so I can either go 2 routes. I can either go full offensive and hope that it misses, or I can go with Feather Dance and lower its attack. Luckily it does miss, and I decide to go ahead and use another one. That way when it does eventually hit with Shadow End, it's dealing very little to me, and half of its health gets taken in return. But now that it is at half, let's see if I made the right choice. I go for Facade, and it's not quite enough to finish it off, so I definitely made the right choice because it would have taken 3 hits to finish it off, and it would have hit me with a full power Shadow End. So with that, we take it down, and he sends out his final Pokemon, which is a Shadow Lapras. I go for Facade into it. It's dealing over a third, so it will be taken down in 3 hits. So I decide to go ahead and keep playing it safe, going with Protect every other turn, though I think at this point I could have just gone on the offensive and probably taken it down quicker. I go for Facade, taking it down to low yellow, and Shadow Storm really shouldn't do that much. Never mind, it actually does nearly half my health. Had I gotten a crit, there's a good chance I could have gotten taken down by the Ninjask and the Shadow Sky. Anyway, I finish it off, and then all that's left is that Ninjask, which of course doesn't survive a single wing attack, and so I'm able to beat Eldest on the first attempt. Now moving on to the big box legendary, Shadow Lugia, and right away I go for Facade, which is doing about a third. There's a very common theme with this Pokemon so far, and that is while it is very consistent getting through these fights, it's really doing a third to basically everything, which is kind of slowing down these fights. But anyway, we're able to get through Lugia, taking almost no damage whatsoever, and I go into the battle against the final boss, Gravel. He leads with a Shadow Rhydon and Moltres, and right away I go for Feather Dance into the Rhydon, because whenever it hits its Shadow Ends, it's going to take half of its health, and hopefully it's not dealing that much damage to me, which it really isn't after a single Feather Dance. This is also the second reason why I think Feather Dance is so strong, because against Rhydon in particular, a Pokemon I really don't have anything to deal damage to, because it's going to be hurting itself and not really doing that much damage to me, hopefully I'll be able to get through it pretty easily. Now, I did forget to teach Hidden Power before I went into this fight, so I go ahead and teach it over Facade, because at this point Hidden Power Rock is just going to be better than Facade. So let's go into the battle for a second attempt. This time I go for Hidden Power into the Moltres, and it takes it down in a single hit, which is very good to see. Then out comes his next Pokemon, Exeggutor. Rhydon does hit a Shadow End at full power, dealing quite a bit of damage. Go for Protect to heal a little bit of that back. And then I go for Feather Dance into Rhydon, hoping that the Exeggutor is going to miss this turn, and luckily it does. Rhydon does hit another Shadow End though, taking itself down to a quarter. I go for Protect to heal up a little bit. And then I take down the Exeggutor with Wing Attack, and then out comes what is possibly the most annoying Pokemon on his team, and that is the Shadow Tauros with Intimidate, because now I'm not sure if I'll be able to take down his next Pokemon in a single hit, which, taking down the Rhydon, then reveals he has a Shadow Articuno, which unfortunately probably won't be a one-shot anymore with Hidden Power Rock because of that Intimidate. So, after a Protect and a turn stalling out the Shadow Sky, I go ahead and go for Hidden Power, and it's dealing quite a bit of damage, but unfortunately it's not a one-shot. And Articuno hits me with a Shadow Chill, doing quite a bit more damage than I expected, though the Shadow Sky is up, making that even stronger. And now I go ahead and go for Hidden Power to finish off the Articuno, which brings out his final Pokemon, a Shadow Zapdos, which is still going to hit very hard even though the Shadow Sky ends this turn. But before it does, Tauros hits a Shadow Rush, taking me down to 37, and while I do get a Hidden Power off, it's only doing a third, and I get taken down. So with that, let's go ahead and go into the final attempt, which is attempt number 6. I've used up all my rare candies, and I got up to level 82 with them, and just leveled up to level 83, and I'm able to take down the Moltres just as before. Rhydon is able to hit on the first turn, which does take itself down to half health. I go for Feather Dance like before to lower its attack, but Exeggutor actually hits a Shadow Wind this time, which does take me down a little further than I'd like to be. I go for a Protect, and then I decide to go ahead and double down with Feather Dance, bringing Rhydon down to -4, because I really want to basically ignore it. As long as it, like I've said many times, doesn't get a crit, it's perfectly safe. So I go for Wing Attack to take down the Exeggutor, and then he sends out Tauros, which between the two is definitely the bigger threat. So I'd go ahead and start taking it down right away, though unfortunately because of the Intimidate I only do half to it, and so it's able to set up Shadow Sky, which means I want to stall at least a couple turns. So I go for Protect, and then because I know the Tauros is going for Shadow Hold this turn, I can go ahead and Feather Dance the Rhydon just to waste a turn and make it so it does even less damage, and then I can go for Protect on the following turn, which will make it so that the Shadow Sky only has one more turn left before his bigger threats come out, with the first being, of course, his Shadow Articuno. So I take down Tauros, and now that I'm 7 levels higher, hopefully I'll be able to take it down in a single hit. So after using Protect for another turn to heal up to nearly half, it's time to finally see, is it a one-shot now? And it is very much not. Taking it down to red, which is certainly fine, but it's not even close. Now, luckily, Articuno really isn't dealing that much damage to me, because after 2 turns of leftovers, I'm able to heal up nearly all the damage it just did. And so he sends out a final Pokemon, the Shadow Zapdos once again, and it probably won't be a 2-shot, so I'm going to be as safe as I can. Go for Hidden Power, which, yeah, looks to be doing just under half, unfortunately. If I were just a level or 2 higher, I definitely could have taken it down in 2 hits instead. But as it is, I think I'm still pretty good here. Go for another Hidden Power, taking it down to low red. Shadow Bolt takes me down to 43, and Rhydon hits another Shadow Wind, taking me down to 23, so I know Rhydon is doing about 20 HP every time. and because I outspeed Zapdos, I'm able to take it down, and Rhydon cannot take me down without a critical hit, which it luckily does not get, and so I'm able to beat Greevil on the 6th attempt. So let's go ahead and move on to our other competitor. After arriving on Dark Isle, Fearow goes into battle against Lavrina, and I'm able to immediately take out her Gorbis with the Drill Peck, and then she sends out Roselia. But unlike Pidgeot, I do want to get rid of Gardevoir as soon as possible because I don't want to risk getting frozen and losing time there. Then she sends out her Shadow Farfetch'd, which of course will go down to another Drill Peck. Now the one downside of taking down Gardevoir is that it technically loses a little bit of time if I don't get frozen because of the animation of Leech Seed. But I think that's kind of worth the risk. I take down Roselia, and then all that's left is the Shadow Altaria, which will probably take a couple hits to take down. It nearly gets taken down by a single Drill Peck, and then I swap over to Facade to save a few power points. Anyway, with that, Lavrina is defeated, and we move to the top of the volcano, where we run into Snaddle, and right away I go for Drill Peck into the Quagsire, which isn't quite a one-shot. Luckily, it is just going for Waterfall, just like it was doing against Pidgeot, so I can just ignore it and move on to the Metang instead, which Hidden Power Fighting takes it down to half, another Ice Punch, luckily no freeze, and just like the other half of the video with Pidgeot, I am going to play it extremely safe, going for Protect every other turn, just to ensure that I don't have to refight him multiple times. I take down the Metang, and then he sends out Scizor. Now, I do make a bit of a mistake here. I decide to leave Scizor alive because it doesn't really have any great damaging moves against me, but the thing is that Scizor is just a much stronger attacker than Quagsire is. So I definitely should have gotten rid of it as soon as possible, and on top of that, Solrock isn't quite a two-shot with Hidden Power Fighting, so it is going to be able to hit me with a Shadow Rave. And because of Fearow's slightly worse defensive stats, it is going to hurt a lot more. So Solrock survives on the Sliver, hits me with the Shadow Rave, taking me down to a little under half, and Steel Wing connects, taking me down to 41 HP. I go for Protect just to stall out that Shadow Sky, but at this point, it's kind of all in vain. I definitely made a mistake right at the beginning there, not going after Quagsire, and so I get taken down to 1 HP, and surprisingly survive another turn, but at this point there's really nothing I can do. I decide to just go ahead and take down the Cast Form, but now comes his final Pokemon, a Shadow Starmie, and I get taken down by Slash. Now since I did Fearow second, I already knew how fast Pidgeot got through this section of the game, and that I did the extra training within the volcano, which I decided to ignore when going with Fearow because I knew it was falling behind at the start of Dark Isle. Which, in hindsight, I really should have just done because now a level higher and this battle isn't nearly so bad. But once again, I do take down the Quagsire, which I think is definitely a misplay. But anyway, I'm able to take down Scizor in a single Drill Peck, and then out comes Shadow Solrock, which at level 70 probably still isn't a two-shot, but I'm going to be able to survive its attacks a little better. It's able to set up Shadow Sky just as before. And of course Metang gets a critical Ice Punch, which is a bit unfortunate. Go for Protect, because I want to stall out those turns of Shadow Sky. And on this turn, instead of going for Hidden Power Fighting, I actually decide to go for Drill Peck. I don't think it actually makes a difference because it'd be 80 plus stab, bring it up to 120, and then halve down to 60, just like the Hidden Power Fighting is. So I think it's the exact same amount of damage. But anyway, I decide to go ahead and go for it, and then I take down the Solrock, and then he sends out Cast Form. Metang hits an Ice Punch, taking me down to 5 HP, but the Shadow Sky has ended. Go for Protect to heal up. And while I don't think the Metang can actually take me down from this HP, I'm actually going to risk it all on a 50% Protect, which will get me up to 38 health. I go for Drill Peck to take down Cast Form, and then he sends out his final Pokemon, a Shadow Starmie. Now, just to be on the safe side, I do decide to Protect here. That will bring me outside of crit, I think, for Metang to take me down. So I go for Drill Peck, which takes down Starmie in a single hit, and all that's left is Metang, which never froze, and I'm able to take it down. Though in hindsight, definitely should have kept it alive with the Quagsire like I did in Pidgeot. Anyway, now moving on to the battle against Ardos, and he leads with his Alakazam and Shadow Swallow. I, of course, outspeed both of them, and so I'm able to take down the Alakazam right away. Then out comes the Kingdra. I go for Protect to stall at the Shadow Sky. And then between the two, I think I want to get rid of Swallow. If it does decide to go for Shadow Half, it's more dangerous for Fearow because it's not nearly as defensive as Pidgeot is. Unfortunately, that does mean I am going to take an Ice Beam, which does a bit more damage than I expected. I go for Protect, and then I decide to go ahead and take down the Kingdra because it is dealing more damage, and even with a Rock Tomb, I don't think I'll be slower than Electabuzz, which is his next Shadow Pokemon. Now, I do want to get rid of Electabuzz right away because it does have Shadow Storm, or it could use Shadow Half, dealing a ton of damage to me. But of course, I want to heal up a bit before that. I go for Facade, and to my surprise, Electabuzz actually is faster than me, though a Facade does take it down in a single hit. And then he sends out his final Pokemon, the Shadow Snorlax. Rock Tomb takes me all the way down to 26, I heal up to 38, and I go for a Protect to heal up a little bit more. And maybe, in hindsight, I should have just gone on the offensive against Snorlax, but because it has a 40% chance to miss, I thought it'd be worth risking it. But unfortunately, that does lead to a loss against Ardos. So I go into the battle for a second attempt, and this time I actually get rid of Swellow right away because I want to be able to heal without Shadow Sky interfering. And then I can worry about taking down his other Pokemon, starting with the Alakazam, and then he sends out Heracross, which I need to take down next because I actually do end up slower than the Electabuzz. Of course, that'll be after a bit of a heal. Now this unfortunately does mean that Kingdra is going to get off another Ice Beam, dealing quite a bit of damage to me. But hopefully, as long as the Snorlax misses, I should be fine. Go for another Protect, and then I take down the Electabuzz with Facade. And then that brings out the Snorlax once again. And now all I need is a bit of luck because I get taken down to 76 HP. Go for Protect to bring myself nearly to 90. And then I go for Drill Peck into the Snorlax. Not quite enough to take it down. I get taken down to 37. And Snorlax does actually miss. Go for another Protect. And now I finish off the Snorlax. And that just leaves the Kingdra, which I don't think takes me down from this range. So with one more Drill Peck, I'm able to take it down and beat Ardos on the second attempt. Not too bad. Now moving on to Gorgon, and it's time to see if Hidden Power fighting was really worth it. I take down the Slowking in a single hit with Drill Peck, and then he sends out his Aggron. I get hit by a Slash, dealing quite a bit of damage. And because of that, I actually want to get rid of Ursaring first, so I go for Drill Peck, which does take it down in a single hit, and then he sends out Walrein. Aggron hits an Iron Tail, which lowers my defense, but because it's the last physical attacker on his team, I can actually take it down now, which Hidden Power takes it down in a single hit. Okay, well that's great. Then he sends out Poliwrath, his first Shadow Pokemon. Ice Beam takes me down below half and I get frozen. Come on. Anyway, going into the battle once again. This time, instead of attacking the Aggron right away, I actually start dealing damage to the Walrein because it deals a ton of damage with its Ice Beams. And this time, I also didn't get a defense drop, so it's not as important for me to take down the Aggron at this point. Then out comes the Poliwrath once again. And Aggron hits an Iron Tail, getting a crit, taking me down to 34, so I need to take down Poliwrath though, otherwise it's going to set up Shadow Sky, and so I need a miss from Aggron, and luckily it does. I go for Protect, and then once again, I think I need another miss. Come on, Aggron. Okay, I survive on 10 HP, and Hidden Power finishes it off. Okay, an easy second attempt. Now moving on to Eldest, and he leads with the Shadow Manectric and Ninjask. And right away I go for Facade to take down Manectric in a single hit, and I get paralyzed, which of course leads to a loss. So I go into the battle once again, and right away go for Facade into Manectric just as before, hopefully no paralysis. But as it turns out, Manectric was actually a range, which is extremely unfortunate. So it's able to set up Shadow Sky, which means that the Salamence coming out is going to deal a lot more damage. Now, luckily, I don't actually have to make contact with Manectric a second time. I can go for Hidden Power to take it down, and then he sends out the Salamence. Hopefully, it just decides to go for Shadow Hold. I go for Protect to stall out the Fruity Pebbles, and Salamence is going straight on the offensive. Okay, well that's not great. I go for Drill Peck, and it takes it down almost a half, not quite, and it gets a crit, taking me all the way down to 18 HP. Now that the Shadow Sky has ended though, I can actually start healing. Maybe it was a range? Drill Peck gets a crit, takes it down. Okay, then out comes Flygon. Maybe there's still a chance at victory here. I go for a Drill Peck into Flygon because it is a lot weaker, and it still doesn't go down in a single hit. Double Edge takes me down to 39. Go for Protect, bringing me back up to yellow. And so I'm able to take down the Flygon. But unfortunately, I need to get lucky against the Marowak. If it hits, I lose. If it doesn't, there's a chance at victory still. So I go for Drill Peck, and it does take it below half. It misses. Of course, another Protect to heal up as much as I can. And another Drill Peck finishes off, bringing out his final Pokemon, which is his Shadow Lapras, which luckily is going to set up Shadow Sky on the first turn. So it's not a danger right away. Drill Peck doesn't quite take it down to half, though it once again could be a range. I might have just gotten a very low roll. So I just need a high roll, and maybe I can still win on this attempt. I go for Drill Peck, and Fearow hits a clutch critical hit, taking down Lapras. Fearow with the back-to-back saves in this fight, able to take down Eldest on the second attempt because of it. Nice job, Fearow. But with that being said, we now move on to the big box legendary, Shadowlugia, and now we'll have to see how it does. I go for Drill Peck, and it's not quite doing half, but we've seen this many times before with Fearow. Will it get a crit taking down Lugia in another turn? It does not. Honestly, it's not all that surprising, but anyway, I'm able to defeat Shadowlugia at about half health going into the final fight against Greevil. He of course leads with a Shadow, Moltres, and Rhydon, and unfortunately Drill Peck doesn't get a one-shot on Moltres, and I'm taken down fairly quickly by Rhydon, so I go back in for a second attempt just to double check, and yeah, it's doing about 3/4 of its health, and it looks like Moltres is doing about 1/4 of mine, because with a crit it did a little over half. So I go for another Drill Peck to take it down, and then out comes the Shadow Executor, and I know for a fact it'll go down in a single hit. Now, it's really a question of which Pokemon do I want to take down first between Rhydon and Tauros, because both of these Pokemon are very strong, and with an Intimidate, Rhydon might not actually be able to be taken down by a Hidden Power fighting anymore, which it isn't, and so I get taken down very quickly. Now at this point I really have two options. I can either do a lot of extra training in order to guarantee Moltres goes down in a single hit, or I can get poisoned and use Facade, which is exactly what I would have done for Pidgeot had it gotten a worse Hidden Power type. And unfortunately, Fearow is in that position right now, so I go for Facade, taking down Moltres in a single hit, then out comes the Executor, and then I go for Drill Peck to take down the Executor, which then sends out the Tauros once again, and hopefully, despite the attack drop, I still will be able to take down Tauros in a single hit. Rhydon does hit a Shadow and taking me down to half, and luckily Facade does take down Tauros in a single hit, and then out comes the Articuno, and Rhydon hits another Shadow and finishing me off, which is a bit unfortunate, but this is really what it comes down to, is getting the luck of not getting hit by Rhydon, which unfortunately is kind of difficult. I used up all my rare candies, and this is now attempt number 42, because unfortunately Fearow is playing the Executor Rhydon lottery. Now luckily Executor is going for Shadow Hold, which does mean that it is wasting a turn before going for Shadow End, which does give me a slight advantage in that, but it unfortunately all just comes down to luck, because if I take too much damage from the Shadow Ends, the poison finishes me off, or I just get taken down by the legendary birds later on in the fight. But with that, we are able to beat Greevil, and now it's time to see how these birds stacked up against each other. Now, Pidgeot is the clear winner of this battle at 10 hours 23 minutes and 48 seconds, whereas Fearow is at 13 hours 34 minutes flat. Now, with this victory and how this concluded, I do want to probably change something in the future. That being, if a Pokemon needs to get swapped out with another Shadow variant, I don't think I should waste all the time purifying it and then leveling it up, when I could just take the IVs from that one and move it over, and probably the nature as well. That way it's not a ton of wasted time for the Pokemon that unfortunately had to make the swap. With that being said though, I don't think it was enough time for Fearow to realistically catch up to Pidgeot anyway, because that was only about an hour's difference, and this was a victory of more than 2 hours. There is also the other issue of Hidden Power. Now personally, I like Hidden Power. I like its randomness, I like that it can make good Pokemon great, and adversely, I like that it can make good Pokemon bad by simply rolling a bad Hidden Power type. So I'm not exactly sure how to handle it, because it really was a huge boon to Pidgeot having Hidden Power Rock to deal with Greevil's team. However, at the same time, I do think that Fearow got arguably a better Hidden Power type for most of the trainers in the game. But the problem is that Rock is just so good against Greevil that it really speeds up that fight for it so much, whereas it would have had to probably go the Facade route just like Fearow did, and it probably would have gotten a very similar amount of losses. So I'm not exactly sure how to handle the Hidden Power situation. I really do like Hidden Power, and I really don't want to get rid of it, but I guess if you have any feedback, please put it down below. Now to move on to the pros and cons of these Pokemon, and why I think they did better than the other than the issues just outlined prior. Starting with, of course, our Victor Pidgeot, and it, of course, comes down to the move Feather Dance, the fact that it's a little more defensive, and also it's still quite strong and fast. Like, the extra speed with Fearow really isn't all that necessary because even Pidgeot is able to outspeed everything. And so it just comes down to being a well-rounded Pokemon that can take a lot of damage and deal a decent amount of damage back. However, its problems really started to show in the late game when a lot of these stronger threats were taking anywhere from 3 to 4 hits to take down consistently, so it did prolong a lot of fights, but I'd say overall Pidgeot was just very solid. Fearow, on the other hand, because of its lower defenses, it meant that it was a little more prone to just getting knocked out by things, but its higher attack and better flying type move did mean that it took down threats a lot quicker. It's just really unfortunate that it stuck with Peck and Fury Attack for so much of the game before it eventually gets Drill Peck at level 40. But anyway, with that being said, Pidgeot finds itself in the A- tier, and unfortunately Fearow finds itself in the C tier. Though I think, of course, with a few changes, it definitely could have done better. But anyway, if you did enjoy this video, consider liking and subscribing. If you have any Pokemon suggestions, please put them down below. Thank you so much for watching, and bye!